Welcome. I'm Jeff Resnick, Chief of the History of Medicine Division at the National Library of Medicine and the National Institutes of Health. Thank you for joining us today as we continue our 2023 series of all virtual NLM history talks with the 7th annual NLM Michael E. DeBakey Lecture in the History of Medicine. NLM history talks promote awareness and use of NLM and related historical collections for research, education, and public service in biomedicine, the social sciences, and the humanities. The series also supports the commitment of the National Library of Medicine in two ways. Commitment to recognizing the diversity of its collections, which span 10 centuries, encompass a range of digital and physical formats, and originate from nearly every part of the globe. They also demonstrate the commitment of the library to foreground the voices of people of color, women, and individuals of a variety of cultural and disciplinary backgrounds who value the collections and use them to advance their research, teaching, and their learning. We supplement NLM History Talks with speaker interviews on our blog, Circulating Now, located at circulatingnow.nlm.nih.gov. I'll add that NLM History Talks are made possible by an outstanding team here at the National Library of Medicine and at the National Institutes of Health videocasting, and I want to thank each and every one of my colleagues for their time and their talent in bringing this program to you, the public. I also wish to thank them for helping me orchestrate the Q&A following today's talk. In this regard, I'd like to call your attention to the live feedback button under the video stream you are watching. Please use this feature to send questions to me, which I will then share with our speaker during the Q&A. Indeed, today's program, like all of our talks, is being live streamed globally, and it will be archived by NIH Videocasting for free access by anyone, anywhere. This access is made possible by a generous gift to the NLM by the Michael E. DeBakey Medical Foundation. And it is that gift in which 2016 helped our institution to establish the NLM Michael E. DeBakey Fellowship in the History of Medicine. The fellowship provides up to $10,000 to support research in the historical collections of the NLM, which include the papers of Michael E. DeBakey. These papers reflect the diverse areas in which he made a lasting impact as a legendary American surgeon, educator, and medical statesman, from surgery to medical education to healthcare policy and much, much more. We are currently accepting applications for the 2024 cycle of the NLM DeBakey Fellowship Program. The application deadline is actually next Friday, September 29th, 2023. And if you Google NLM DeBakey Fellowship, you will find the application details. The gift of the DeBakey Medical Foundation also makes possible this portion of the NLM History of Medicine lecture series, the annual Michael E. DeBakey Lecture in the History of Medicine, offered by a selected fellow based on her or his completed research in the historical collections of the NLM. And this year, it's my pleasure and privilege to welcome Dr. Kelly O'Donnell, Visiting Assistant Professor of U.S. History at Bryn Mawr College and a 2019 NLM Michael E. DeBakey Fellow. A historian of medicine and gender in the United States, Dr. O'Donnell's research focuses on reproductive health, technology, consumer culture, and health politics. She received her PhD from the program in the history of medicine, history of science and medicine at Yale University. Dr. O'Donnell has published widely on the history of women's health, including several articles drawn from her dissertation, which was a biography of journalist and feminist activist Barbara Seaman. One of those articles won the 2022 Stanley Jackson Prize from the Journal of the History of Medicine and Allied Sciences. That was for best article published in the journal in the preceding 3 years. Dr. O'Donnell is currently completing a book manuscript derived from that project for Rutgers University Press. It will be focused on debates about the birth control pill in the 1960s and 1970s. She also recently co-edited 2 special journal issues on the history of reproductive health post-Dobbs, one of which was for the Bulletin of the History of Medicine. Her next book project, the subject of her talk today, is a history of doctors' wives in the United States. It will use the complex figure of the physician's wife as a window into the practice, reform, and popular reception of American medicine. So, Dr. O'Donnell, thank you very much for joining us today. We look forward to your talk entitled Mrs. Medicine, Doctors' Wives and the Making of Modern American Healthcare. Dr. O'Donnell, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Resnick, for that very warm welcome and introduction. I'd like to also give thanks to the National Library of Medicine and its History of Medicine division for making this event and my research more broadly possible. I gained a lot from my time spent as a DeBakey Fellow, which helped me get this project off the ground initially. So I'm really genuinely honored to be here to give this year's DeBakey lecture. And finally, also thanks to everyone in the virtual audience out there for taking the time to join me this afternoon from wherever you are across the country or the world. I'm so excited to share some of this research with you today, which is still ongoing and evolving. Before I get too far into the weeds about what I've been working on and all the great sources that I found at NLM and other places, I'd like to start off by talking about one person in particular, and that is Diana Cooper DeBakey, first wife of Michael DeBakey. This is a DeBakey lecture after all. I perhaps took that too literally, but in the early 70s, a journalist writing for Today's Health visited Houston, Texas, and interviewed Diana DeBakey for an upcoming profile for the magazine that was originally titled A Surgeon's Wife. The final title was The Special Challenge of Being the Surgeon's Wife. And the portrait painted within this article was definitely one of obstacles to be continually overcome in her marriage and life due to the medical profession and its continual demands on both her husband and their marriage. The article began, as you see down there, living with and loving a man as dedicated as heart surgeon Michael DeBakey demands extraordinary toughness and delicacy. Diana Cooper DeBakey has risen to the challenge with uncommon grace and strength. So over the course of nearly 5 pages, the article chronicled the day-to-day life of the wife of this acclaimed doctor, focusing on the sacrifices she made and the loneliness that she sometimes faced, but also ultimately on her dedication and her pride in her husband and their marriage. The article depicted some of the biggest challenges as including the relative absence of Dr. DeBakey from his home life. To become the successful and famous surgeon that he was, he spent most of his time at the hospital and out at work. He would leave the house at 4:30 in the morning and not return until 9 or 10 p.m. or sometimes later. When he wasn't performing surgeries or teaching, he was writing or traveling extensively for his work. Sometimes he joined him. Mrs. DeBakey even shared with the journalist her strategies for convincing her husband to eat some food, especially vegetables, other than the just a small cup of soup that he'd request when he'd come home exhausted late at night. Most nights, Mrs. DeBakey could be found at home, alone with a good book or in the company of her television set, as the article described. A typical day for her can include keeping up with her correspondence, maintaining her intense volunteering schedule, which included time spent at the hospital, and sometimes serving as a hostess. Sometimes spontaneously when her husband would invite people for dinner without advance notice, or for more people than expected to invite, as he was wont to do sometimes, as you can see in one of the clippings there. Even more time consuming, the article explained, was, quote, her work with the Baylor faculty wives, many of whom live a modified version of the same largely husbandless life that she has. So this kind of volunteering included things like holding book discussions and socializing, but primarily, as the author put it, making life more endurable for married hospital residents, many of whom are from foreign countries, and for the families of new members. Tragically, Diana DeBakey died unexpectedly of heart failure just before this issue of Today's Press or Today's Health was going to press. You can see the note at the bottom. But the article itself ended with the following resigned and hopeful exchange up on the screen. As she began to prepare her husband's dinner, I asked her how she had managed to remain not only stable, but happy under the stress of almost continuous separation. Did she like life that way? No, she answered. No, I don't. I'd change it tomorrow if I could. But you see, I love my husband very much. I think he's the greatest surgeon in the world. I think he's a genius, a true genius. No matter what happens, he's going to stick to it and do the best he can. So I think I have to go along and do the best I can. I've been really fascinated by figures like Diana DeBakey, doctors' wives, for many years now. For my dissertation, I wrote, as Jeff explained, a biography of the journalist Barbara Seaman, who was married to a psychiatrist. Before she wrote The Doctor's Case Against the Pill, her first book, Seaman actually got her start in journalism by co-authoring pop psychology articles with her husband, Gideon. They had a syndicated advice column together in newspapers at one point in the 70s. And they co-authored her third book, Women in the Crisis in Sex Hormones, up there on the screen. There were just a lot of ways that I noticed, particularly in her early career, that she leveraged her position as a doctor's wife and his medical credentials and authority, that I just couldn't ignore the topic. It also raised some pretty basic questions and some pretty big questions for me. What did it mean to be a doctor's wife, socially and culturally and historically? How did that change over time? And what can these women tell us about the history of medicine if we go looking for them in the archive? But first, what do I mean exactly by doctor's wife? Let me just clarify who this could be a little bit and what their identities could comprise. In my mind, I kind of lump different types of doctors' wives together into three main categories. Physicians married to other physicians, so women doctors, nurses, and everyone else. Although historically there were relatively very few women doctors, and many of the earliest female MDs in the 19th century did often tend to remain single, I found that women physicians did tend to disproportionately marry other physicians. If you look, for example, through the alumni files of Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania, which I've done, the numbers do seem pretty skewed in this direction of marrying other physicians. On the other hand, it also seems that male physicians did tend to seek out nurses as wives in pretty large numbers. So doctor-nurse marriages were historically very common. Women in these dual medical marriages, whether they were doctors or nurses themselves, varied in the amount of professional engagement that they retained after becoming married. In both cases, women tended to not continue working, especially not full-time after marriage, until after really the 1970s. They dropped down to part-time work, if any at all, and often become full-time housewives and mothers. I'm taking the time to point this out because it could explain some of the unusually high level of engagement and participation in their husbands' professional lives relative to other sectors of employment. But I don't really see women's independent professional expertise being too much of an influence in this story, because in my final group, other or everyone else, this encompasses basically anyone who didn't receive any type of medical training. If they had an independent career, the women of the other group were often teachers or something to that effect before pursuing wifehood and motherhood. But this category and all three categories became a distinct social identity of the doctor's wife in general that conveyed its own sort of expertise over time. It was also extremely rare for any doctor's wife to ever refer to their own expertise or experience independently if it existed, like, for example, having been a nurse. The identity of the doctor's wife definitely, for a very long time, seemed to trump that of former nurse or even sometimes physician in her own right in public spaces like medical auxiliaries or in the media. So I'm now convinced, after a few years of research, that in order to understand the history of American medicine more fully, you have to acknowledge the people who were standing there next to the doctors while they're living their lives and having their physician careers. The women who have been largely ignored by historians in favor of other women with independent careers of their own, like nurses or women physicians, who have received some decent amount of attention. But my next project is to write what I believe will be the first comprehensive history giving this population its due. And Diana DeBakey, for the record, had worked in nursing. Given my kind of secondary interests in the history of medical technology, I also tend to view the doctor's wife as a kind of medical instrument and a historical instrument. I think there's a lot to be said about, for example, the professional utility of a spouse. We can ask what a wife can do for an individual practitioner or for the profession as a whole in terms of labor and institution building. The doctor's wife can also be, in another way, a barometer or a thermometer for tracking shifts over time in the medical profession, giving us a new measurement of some very big ideas historically. So just for one easy example of that, what better way could there possibly be to gauge the prestige and cultural authority of a profession over time than by seeing how attractive its members were or were not in terms of romance and the marriage market? Viewing physicians as romantic interests and especially as desirable spouses has been a pretty consistent theme in American culture since at least the 1930s, if not before then. And I'm sure many of you can think of quite a few examples from television or the movies where a young doctor is presented to a female protagonist as a catch, often especially surgeons. Starting around the 70s, though, there's suddenly all kinds of reports about how absolutely miserable it could be to be married to a doctor. Words like challenges and struggle start to appear a lot more, along with major concerns about things like loneliness and the separation that prolonged, specialized, and especially hospital-based training and practice necessarily began to entail more and more often. Mrs. DeBakey's profile in Today's Health is just one example of what I think is a clear tonal shift. So it's pretty clear that we see over the course of the 20th century sort of home to hospital transition impacting marriages and families of the profession. I'm also looking at a pretty long time frame with my study because I want to capture some longer term professional trends and big cultural shifts. So I am planning to start around the founding of the AMA, which is in the 1840s. And I'll probably end at some point in the 90s, which is after the AMA Women's Auxiliary, which was founded in the 20s, evolved into what is now known as the AMA Alliance. So this is a broader non-gendered group name that's meant to be more inclusive of different types of physician families, clearly reflecting some big changes both in medicine and its demographic compositions and in the family over time. And that's really where I'd like to spend the rest of my time with you today, focusing on the Women's Medical Auxiliary as an institution worthy of historical inquiry. Not all doctors' wives, of course, would have joined a group like this, but there were many such groups. It's also, I found, really the easiest starting point, easiest entry point for locating doctors' wives in the historical archive, and arguably sometimes the most fun. So while local volunteer groups consisting of philanthropic society women, and on many occasions, a lot of doctors' wives have existed attached to local institutions like hospitals since the 19th century. The medical auxiliary, organized as a space specifically for medical spouses, is primarily an early 20th century phenomenon. Organizing alongside medical societies began first at the local and state levels. Oklahoma and Texas, for example, had formally organized women's auxiliaries associated with their state medical societies, dating back to the 1900s and 1910s. And on the right there is a illustration of Mrs. Red, the Texas auxiliary organizer, kind of hailed as the mother of the women's auxiliary for the AMA overall. In part inspired and motivated by all of the medical volunteerism during World War I, like the Red Cross, the idea of the Women's Medical Auxiliary spread rapidly during the 1920s. In 1922, a newly organized National Auxiliary presented itself before the AMA House of Delegates, seeking recognition for their group. Here in the Journal of the AMA, we see the new corresponding secretary of that group, Mrs. H.L.D. Kirkham from Houston, reporting after this has taken place. The Women's Auxiliary of the American Medical Association is no longer a dream, but a realized entity. In the following years, state and local level counterpart organizations proliferated. Here on the screen, you can see some congratulations from the then president of the Kentucky State Medical Association to the Kentucky Women's Auxiliary in 1932. It's not just for organizing their group recently, but for starting their own publication, the Quarterly. This is drawn from the NLM's own collection of the Quarterly, which is very comprehensive. By 1941, so about a decade later, we can see not just an expansion into the rest of the states, but major recruitment efforts within those now existing branches. In Arkansas, the state chairman, Mrs. Edward D. McKnight, set an ambitious goal in her update to the organization in the pages of the Journal of the Arkansas Medical Society. Every eligible wife an auxiliary member, every eligible doctor's wife, that is. That same year, the National Auxiliary had exceeded their goal of 25,000 dues-paying members by more than 1,500, and they were still awaiting at press time from many of the states who were reporting new auxiliaries and new members in existing units. But why organize doctors' wives? In part, this was definitely a social organization and a support organization, bringing women with shared interests and struggles together. But it went far beyond that, particularly in the first half of the 20th century, and especially at mid-century. The doctor's wife was viewed by the profession and society at large as a distinct social role, with distinct obligations and opportunities before her. Being married to medicine gave them a perspective that other women simply didn't have. Furthermore, they could be extremely valuable to the profession. As Mrs. Herbert Ulrich put it in her prologue to a 50th anniversary commemorative history of the National Auxiliary, the founders and early leaders had a keen sense of the value of joint endeavor, but were convinced that combined activity of doctors and their wives throughout the nation could have far-reaching influence on problems affecting the health of America. I'm especially interested, for example, in digging through old AMA conference programs and trying to figure out exactly what the wives were getting up to when they went with their husbands to Atlantic City or San Francisco or other conference locations, mixing with other wives from across the country. The auxiliary held its own conference proceedings simultaneously each year with the main AMA one. So they're kind of getting a vacation out of it, sure, but they're also organizing and figuring out what public health programming or fundraising strategies and so forth to take away back to their own communities with their own local branches. And doctors' wives were definitely out circulating in the wider community and society, exerting a pretty big influence on what I'm thinking of as kind of the cultural messaging around medicine at the time. In the summer of 1956, for example, Dr. Elmer Hess, who was then the immediate past president of the AMA, met with a group of them to discuss their special role in the continued success of organized medicine. Invited by the Women's Auxiliary to speak at a lunch session, Hess explained that a doctor's wife could be her husband's greatest advertisement. After all, he admitted, we can't talk about ourselves the way our wives can talk about us. And that was true. But far beyond that, he claimed that their husbands' very careers may depend on their understanding of public relations, which becomes a big keyword in this moment. So like other wives, doctors' wives should be a good homemaker and mother, but they needed something extra. They needed patience and participation. Hess, like many others around this time, believed that women married to physicians had a unique opportunity and obligation to represent their husbands' professions in the community, to spread factual information, and even to encourage voting on matters relating to health politics. So in the post-war US, the notion of a doctor's wife as a sort of free public relations agent spread throughout the profession. As one California Women's Auxiliary organizer pointed out, more questions are asked of a physician's wife over a bridge table, in the beauty parlor, at the market, than are ever asked of the physician himself. So, particularly in this post-war moment, I think it's also a very, especially 1950s moment, when Hess is making his speech, the socializing of doctors' wives was consciously mobilized by the medical profession. So when these women are getting together at their luncheons or playing bridge or putting on fashion shows, these weren't just frivolous social activities. I've argued that rather than to kind of dismiss them as silly or secondary, we should actually take them very seriously, historically speaking. Not only were they sites of major fundraising campaigns, but they were also sites of pretty significant communications happening. These are the women who are intentionally disseminating all sorts of information relating to healthcare, public health, and the medical establishment into their wider communities. So a classic example of this that many of you may have heard of already was an AMA auxiliary campaign known as Operation Coffee Cup. In the early 60s, when politicians were debating what would ultimately become Medicare, like the King-Anderson bill, the AMA launched this innovative campaign to oppose this legislation. The Women's Auxiliary, with branches all over the country, encouraged its members to hold coffee clutches with their neighbors and friends. So while sipping on their tea or coffee and eating their snacks, they would listen to a specially made record, Ronald Reagan Speaks Out Against Socialized Medicine. Listening to Reagan, who was then a celebrity, women would learn about why this new proposed program would be an encroachment on physicians' freedom to practice and would lead to inferior medical care. So the idea behind Operation Coffee Cup was basically a viral marketing campaign mobilizing doctors' wives and even their coffee clutches in the battle against socialized medicine. I wanted to note here and pause for a second and say that this was not just an AMA thing, or even a regular allopathic medicine thing. Women's auxiliaries existed for any variety of specialties or flavors of medical practice, and in local, state, regional, national, and occasionally international forms. We see here on the screen, for example, um, a, a new branch in New York of the Women's Auxiliary to the National Medical Association, which I'll talk about in a second. But I wanted to show like a pretty good example of this diversity of auxiliary types and organizing. So I freely confess that I have a bit of an eBay buying habit, but I recently acquired this really fantastic and unusual historical source from 1953 titled Study Course for Women's Auxiliary to the International Chiropractors Association, which begins on the first page by saying, the lay women of chiropractic are a potent factor in the success or failure of each and every chiropractor in the field, in the success or failure of the sick to get well, in the success or failure of the right of a doctor by choice, in short, in the success or failure of chiropractic. So absolutely no pressure, ladies married to chiropractors in the 1950s. It went on to say 80% of chiropractors might be married, but, quote, 50% of the working power of these practicing chiropractors is being lost. By that we mean the wives of chiropractors. They are not carrying their part of the load in the profession of their husbands, who are striving so hard to gain recognition. So this guide, it's pretty lengthy. There's multiple chapters. Was intended as a sort of crash course on the philosophy and practice of chiropractic medicine, so that the wives would be better able to defend and advertise their husbands' practices. How many women today can honestly defend their chiropractor and his condemned profession? It challenged the reader. Echoing many similar sentiments made by AMA members in the same time period, those involved in the International Chiropractors Association also viewed their population of wives as ambassadors of their profession. The study course explained, most women belong to some group, club, or organization in their community. While attending these meetings, many times, the question of an epidemic or health problem is discussed. This is an opportunity for the women of chiropractic to express the benefits derived from the practice of chiropractic. This opportunity is something the chiropractor himself could never hope to have, but the women with the right answers can be of potential value to the chiropractor and his profession. Again, no pressure here. The Women's Homeopathic League of Pennsylvania also got in on this rhetoric too at the same time. At a 1950 meeting, this group was treated to a talk by a man named Leo Brown, who was the public relations director of the Medical Society of Pennsylvania at the time. His presentation, titled Your Public Relations Are Showing, was described as interesting and informative. According to the report from the league's president, Brown pointed out that we, doctors' wives, families, and friends, should, like Caesar's wife, be above reproach and always keep our good public relations showing. As an organized group of women and as individuals, we are able to reach more people than the doctor-patient contact. Brown would then go on later to become an assistant to the vice president of the AMA and to publish and deliver basically that same message to doctors' wives for at least another decade. So there was, as I said, a great variety in the types of auxiliary groups, many of which had regular publications that I've attempted to track extant copies of. The National Medical Association, an organization of Black physicians, had its own entire network of auxiliary groups across the country, kind of a counterpart to the AMAs. Their official publication was the Mouthpiece, which was shown here on screen, 1945 issue with a patriotic cover image. On the inside, in page 2, they have reprinted Langston Hughes's poem, Will V-Day be Me Day Too? Very 1945 issue. Throughout the issue, they address racial discrimination as well as report on activities of their constituent branches. And I only recently was able to track down a few copies of this at Yale, but I know that more exist out there, and I'm excited to go find them. At the NLM, there's a lot of these types of periodicals by various auxiliary groups. So, for example, when I was there, I explored the Quarterly from Kentucky, which I mentioned before, the Ohio Osteopathic Association Auxiliary Bulletin, that's a mouthful of a title, and the Druggist's Wife, which is from the Women's Organization of the National Association of Retail Druggists. The longest running and best preserved publication was, of course, that of the National AMA Auxiliary. It took me literal weeks during my DeBakey Fellowship in 2019 to read through all of the issues that the NLM had on site, which took me from the early 40s through the 90s. Because it appeared in different forms and underwent many changes between the 30s when it began publishing and the 90s and 2000s, the evolution of this one publication alone revealed to me a lot, I think, about the social transformations of medicine and marriage in the 20th century US. Its style, its editorial direction, and its very name changed alongside its parent organization and the culture more generally. Established in the late 1930s as the Bulletin of the Women's Auxiliary to the American Medical Association, it first served as a kind of newsletter reporting on the auxiliary's various local, state, and national political activities. So you see here this kind of roll call of reports from all the different states in alphabetical order. This continued through World War II and into the post-war era of auxiliary growth and expansion. The publication then had a 1960s makeover, transforming into the colorful and highly glossy MD's Wife, with human interest stories and advertisements targeting a population of presumed housewives and doctors' wives. This format more closely resembled some of the iconic women's magazines of that moment. And the early 60s, to me, I think represents sort of a peak auxiliary moment. In 1961, the then president reported that their membership numbers were now over 80,000. The refreshed and retitled publication in 1965, I think, seems to kind of reflect that growth and confidence in the organization. But looking at issues of this publication from the next decade, the 70s, getting back to that, you start to see a much different and at times darker picture. By 1971 or 1972, around the time that Today's Health publishes that profile about the special challenges facing Mrs. DeBakey for being a surgeon's wife, MD's Wife, the publication, also began publishing content framed around challenges and struggles and crises facing this unique population, dilemmas. It also found itself in the middle of rapid change regarding the politics of gender in the medical profession. A younger generation of women sought to maintain careers and professional identities all on their own, including, in increasing numbers, becoming doctors themselves. So in the late 70s, in the wake of the women's movement, changes in the workforce participation for married women, and a major shift regarding the admission of women into the medical profession, MD's Wife no longer seemed like a current or even appropriate name for the auxiliaries publication. In 1977, it became the gender-neutral Facets. The editors reminded readers in their spring issue, remember that women doctors' spouses aren't flattered by an auxiliary publication called MD's Wife. We are extremely glad that men are active auxilians, for they have much to offer. The change of magazine's name is an indication of our desire to integrate them into every facet of our program. The response to this from readers was mixed, but generally approving of the forward-looking change. Some of them were not pleased, of course, more traditionalists. One reader from Pennsylvania wrote to the editors of the magazine, "I am not a piece of carbon polished and cut. I am myself and a physician's wife. Facets is a common word. I am special in that I married a physician. This almost flawless gem prefers to be known as the wife of a loving physician husband." But the auxiliary itself also dropped woman's from its name, recognizing that perhaps the husbands of doctors might like to get involved. Eventually, in the mid-90s, the magazine was changed once again to the AMA Alliance Today, reflecting a complete overhaul of the organization's identity. Now, no longer the auxiliary, but instead the Alliance. And I know that that's, with the changes in publication, a lot to rush through in just a few minutes, but I hope that by looking at that publication and the rest of my talk as well, you get just a little sense of what I see as the extremely rich potential of the doctor's wife as a lens through which to view many different strands of history going on throughout, especially the later 20th century. I'm also really invested in uncovering the stories of these different diverse women as individuals and as part of their broader social networks outside of auxiliaries, absolutely. So what I'll do is end with a request, which is this. I would have loved to have more time today to talk about some of the special archival research challenges that come along with tracking down individual medical spouses and why I chose to stick with auxiliaries. But to compensate for some of those challenges, I do actually plan on launching an oral history component of this project. So if you listening or anyone you know would perhaps like to be interviewed for my book research, or you'd like to share some stories with me, I would actually love to hear from people. I'm not quite there yet in terms of scheduling interviews, but I hope to get that up and running within the next year for sure. Please feel free to email me. My email's on the screen, ksodonnell@bryn-mawr.edu. And with that, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm looking forward to some of your questions.
Dr. O'Donnell, thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Thank you. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, very good. Thank you very much for that fascinating talk. There are a number of questions that interesting talk. This individual writes, does Dr.
Sorry, could you repeat that? You broke up for a second there.
Yes. This person writes in, very interesting talk. Does Dr. O'Donnell know if there were any differences between particular regions of the United States in regard to perceived status as a doctor's wife?
I don't know about status, because that's definitely something that's hard to track. It's going to take a little bit more research in terms of like reception. But there are absolutely all kinds of regional differences running throughout all of this. One big difference is what day-to-day life could look like if you were in, say, a more rural context versus a more urban one. it's also varied with the type of practice in general of medicine that was going on, right? If you had a private practice, especially one kind of working out of or close to the home, there was, especially in an earlier moment, a lot of kind of roping in of doctors' wives into the day-to-day kind of business of medicine. Whereas if you are kind of generally in a more urbanized context, and especially a more hospital-centered context, there was more of a division. I think getting back to the question about status and differences in perception, there definitely seems to be a particular genre of like small town medical practice where, like, you know, the quote unquote country doctor's wife is often a major figure, has pretty high social standing in their particular community, thought of as kind of a leader in the community. I think that gets a little more complicated with, you know, scaling up, you know, your immediate social context. So in a more urban environment, that would look more like, you know, not quite socialized, but club women kind of getting involved in local organizations, being kind of philanthropic kind of patronesses, right? So it's going to look different for sure. But I would love to find some better examples of how exactly that's manifesting. So one thing I'm looking out for, and it's hard to do with something I talked about today, like, you know, through the perspective of the auxiliary, because that's kind of a homogenizing organization.
Thank you. Thank you. So I want to ask a related question that came in because I think it could help drill down a little bit. So this person writes also, I enjoyed your very informative and interesting presentation. You mentioned wives of specialized medical practitioners like chiropractors, which makes me wonder if there was a sort of hierarchy of doctors' wives. And the question is, in your research, did you find evidence that wives of surgeons, cardiologists, and other specialists were perhaps held in higher esteem than wives of, say, proctologists or general practitioners? Maybe can you flesh that out, or perhaps your research isn't there yet? Just another question that came in.
That's a really fascinating question. I'm absolutely going to have to figure that question out, because I know that there has to be, you know, sort of internal hierarchy being unspoken that I'm just unaware of as, you know, not a part of that group, right? But I think that the interesting one of the interesting threads that's kind of going throughout my story that makes my research extremely endlessly complicated is that one of the other big trends is the increasing levels of specialization for medicine in general, kind of going alongside the growth and peaking and then decline of auxiliaries over the course of the 20th century in general. So they're definitely happening kind of at the same time. I think that from my kind of naive observer perspective, surgeons were absolutely held in pretty high esteem. And we know that from, you know, just popular culture, right? That's kind of always like the example pointed to as, like, you know, the like I said, the romantic interest, like, oh, he's not just a doctor, he's a surgeon, right? I don't know enough about the internal politicking of these groups to see if that manifested in any kind of hierarchical way. But I will say that one kind of fun hierarchy fact is that when these auxiliary groups at the state level began, what would happen is you would have the president of the state medical society, and then his wife would automatically be like the president of the women's auxiliary, right? So you see, all that playing out on some level, but that is a phenomenal question.
Thank you. So a few other questions have come in and some very helpful comments about sources. I'm going to read these. So thanks for this talk. This person writes in from the University of Maryland, Baltimore, because they self-identify as, we have a nice collection of women's auxiliary records at the University of Maryland, Baltimore. There is some speculation that we were the first auxiliary board associated with a hospital in the country. I was wondering if you have the first group in your research. Our group was established in 1887, and this individual very kindly sends a link to their digitized records, which I will share with you.
Yes, I'm absolutely going to check that out.
Great.
Yeah, so there's a little bit of fuzziness between, like, depending on like what level or what register you're looking at organizationally, right? Because you do absolutely have these hospital groups and these very local organizations, like, various boards of lady managers and things that were also called auxiliaries in, the 1880s, for example. Not exclusively kind of self-identifying as doctors' wives, for sure. It could just be, society women who wanted to get involved with some cause, right? But often those groups were heavily populated by doctors' wives. But it's really not until you get to the level of like the state society organizations that you see this push for rallying around this identity, right? So in that kind of turn of the century moment, you do have just all sorts of groups kind of not affiliated with each other, a lot of isolated organizing happening. But it's again, not until the 19 teens and 20s when they all start kind of falling under the umbrella of their state org or the national org, in the case of like, the AMA, later the NMA. That's just for, AMA member physicians, right? But that's fascinating. I have not encountered any Maryland groups yet, so I'm excited about that.
Okay, I will send you that information. Thanks to the individual who sent that in. So following on what you just stated, there's another question that's come in. Can you say more about how state medical journals have informed your research or could inform your research? You are probably aware.
Yeah.
Yeah. This person writes further, you're probably aware of the outstanding digital collection of these journals achieved by the Medical Heritage Library, funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities, and to which the NLM has contributed content from its collections.
Yes, and which, when I had a postdoctoral fellowship during the pandemic and all the archives closed, it definitely availed myself of a lot of these sources. Yeah, so a lot of these organizations ultimately had their own standalone publications, like, for example, the Kentucky Quarterly, the various other ones. But for the most part, that's where you would find reports from the medical auxiliaries, right? They would just have like a recurring feature or a section, or the journal would just print, right? That's also, I need to do a little more deep dive on this aspect, but that's also kind of how the AMA's auxiliary publication starts off too. They're a section of the AMA's bulletin, and then they break off to become their own bulletin, right? And from there, right, proceed. So that's a hugely important resource, and just a lot of resource. So I have an extremely overwhelmed Zotero database with lots of fun links. I would love to be able to do like a sort of digital history project, and kind of crunch some of those numbers and words, and visualize some of that data. But that is a fantastic resource, and I hugely recommend it.
Yes, it is. Thank you. Another individual writes in, thank you for this fascinating look at an aspect of our medical history that tends to stay in the shadows of the more prominent male physicians who kept themselves in the spotlight for much of our past. Given that the women you discussed were often outside the spotlight and hence outside the published record, how did you find the historical sources to shine a light on them? Very interesting question.
Well, that's the crux of it, right? Staying in the shadows so that you can kind of push your husband further into the spotlight, right? That's one of the kind of main drives of someone who's going to be at least publicly identifying as a physician's wife. So the reason I focused so heavily on these auxiliaries and these publications today is because, like I said, that really is the easiest way to find these people, because I started a different way, which is, as I said in my interview on Circulating Now, I started with the classic history research source, the personal papers collection, right? So I went looking in some physicians' personal papers, trying to identify individuals that way. But just due to the kind of professional orientation of basically all of these collections, and that kind of self-fashioning of the collections to be about the husband's public-facing medical career, what gets lost is a lot of those kind of details about his personal life, domestic life, the wife folder is an occasional phenomenon that I would encounter, but for the most part, doctors' wives, in the kind of broadly speaking archive of the history of medicine, get disappeared, right, in that effort to kind of create these collections, which is ironic because so many of them are so involved in preserving papers and donating them to archives. So finding them that way was very difficult. And there's a kind of a twin phenomenon there of a very well-intentioned and deeply feminist impulse to kind of view women as individuals in their own right. And therefore, from the other end, you kind of lose that connection of, oh, she married so-and-so, in a lot of, finding aids or descriptions of people, right? So I will often find out about random people and only later make the connection, oh, that's a doctor's wife. Interesting, right? So it's very complicated. In the shadows is absolutely a good way of putting it.
Thank you. So a further question, a really insightful observation that has come in rather, is thank you for this fascinating and necessary research. This individual writes in, I don't know if you are still trying to identify individual women whose stories you want to flesh out, but I've often thought that acknowledgments at the front of textbooks or books by healthcare providers might be a way to uncover and honor some of those women. Anecdotally, this individual writes, it seems the majority of dedications are to their wives, and perhaps those wives had their own professions, etc. It's a bit of a needle in a haystack, but it might be of some value to you.
Yes, that's a great suggestion. It reminds me of that the Twitter hashtag from a few years back, thanks for typing, which was about this phenomenon in general of, wives performing this kind of secretarial labor for people who are publishing, right? Yeah, so a lot of that work often goes unacknowledged, but acknowledgments and dedications are nice little like breadcrumbs that I've found. I also, for similar reasons, really really, I don't love, but appreciate obituaries. And then you take notes on names, and look them up on ancestry.com or whatever things you need to do to find the kind of thread that you can start pulling on to locate these people. But yeah, it's very like needle in a haystacky to approach this from the individual level. But I'm hopeful that I'll be able to have some success there, slowly kind of build up that base of individuals and their stories.
By all measures, I think you will be, and I think a lot of others think you will be too. Just a couple of other questions, if you'll indulge us,
Sure.
because these are really good questions for a really great presentation, great research. Thank you for this wonderful talk. Did your research give any indication that the doctors' wives were effective in pushing their husbands in certain directions, like, for example, charitable or political activism?
That's another great question that I don't want to make generalizations about yet. There's always this kind of like jokey reference to, like on the one Hahnemann yearbook slide, like our better halves, like or in all these kind of speeches and things that people would give at conferences, like, oh, like, I owe this to my wife, or my wife does this or does that, keeps me on track, right? So you can kind of get like subtle hints about what goes on kind of in that intimate domestic sphere, but that kind of thing is especially at the individual level very difficult to get a grasp on. What I do see more often is like I talked about in this talk, the kind of other way around, like the move from medical profession to doctors' wives to the community at large, right? That's like the project of these kind of outreach attempts and so forth. But simultaneously, like every time someone comes over from the AMA Speakers Bureau or whatever, and talks to the auxiliary, like they always like do this dance of like, oh well, like we couldn't do it without you, like it's kind of jokey like domestic humor that goes on. So I'm interested in again, once I get down to the level of the individual, like actually seeing how does influence work kind of in that other direction, because I know that it's going on. I just don't quite know enough to generalize about how that's going on yet.
Right. That's so. This relates to another question that we received regarding the AMA. Did the auxiliaries support themselves, or did the AMA in part subsidize them? And this person writes further, I assume the AMA paid for the journals. And do you have any thoughts about why AMA leadership wanted to do so?
Yeah, so they're definitely subsidized by the parent organization. But they also had their own, membership dues. So it was a combination. But especially when we get into that moment where you see that the publications department, I think, is the one that does this, but they're investing in this rehab of this bulletin making it into MD's wife in the 60s, they've recognized that this group is useful to them for, all the work that they do, convincing people to write to their congressman, or doing all their public health outreach on a volunteer basis. Keep in mind, this is in a moment when the sector of kind of the allied health profession is exploding, and suddenly you have to have all this extra paid labor to maintain your profession, right? So they're looking towards the volunteerism of the wives as something that's useful, that they want to encourage. You can absolutely see the hand there, being like, okay, cool, like we want to support this and keep this going. And I think that's why, it's the longest lasting. It, in some form is still around, where other groups kind of peter out or never reach the kind of scale that they do. That is, that's the big one, right? And it's because of the deep integration of the auxiliary and the parent organization.
I think therein you've got a very dynamic historiographical frame, looking at the history of philanthropy more broadly, and gendered aspects of philanthropy, and any other works that have been written about auxiliaries vis-a-vis philanthropy. Just thinking off the cuff here, those are thoughts coming from, but I'm happy to be in further touch to talk about that, because
yes, please.
When we think about ladies auxiliaries and how they are structured through their own bylaws, through their own focus on certain causes that are either related to the parent organization or not, you begin to see, obviously, very clear degrees of independence, yet also, if not dependence, you see very complex relationships, which you yourself know already in your context. So there's a lot here to unpack. It's very exciting.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is great. So an observation that someone writes in is, one could argue that in some period, the AMA was in effect supporting separate spheres. Very interesting observation.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah.
Okay, so
sorry, we'll also say, just maybe not so much at the national level, but once you get down to kind of more locally, you do see sometimes women physicians getting kind of pushed towards the women's auxiliary as a place where they should kind of go mingle and concern themselves with. So this is absolutely not just a wife thing, but a gender thing.
Fascinating. Another aspect of this, and this is coming from me, and then we'll get to our final question, is the productions of these groups, both in terms of publications, the journals, ephemera, and material productions, awards, plaques, pins. There's another potential avenue there that could open up some resources and paths for research in museums, certainly, obviously.
If anyone has any seeds for the doctor's wife rose that they cultivated in around, like, I don't know, like the late 60s and advertised in a magazine, please send them to me. I'd love to grow one.
Well, I would encourage, if you haven't already, our colleagues at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History, I would contact them. And certainly, perhaps also the resources at the National Agricultural Library. That might be a place worth. They have a fantastic collection of seed catalogs that are worth. You might want to drop them a note. I'm happy to put you in touch with folks I know there if that's helpful. So a final question. Really a statement. This is an excellent talk, but I feel like there's probably more to say. Where do you see your research going from here in ways that perhaps you haven't already shared with us? Is there a larger publication project that we could look forward to? What are your next path? What's your next steps that perhaps you want to share with us in more detail, if at all?
Yeah, so this is a pretty preliminary excerpt from what I see ultimately as being like a very big book project. I've got some dreams for this project, but like I said, I focused on one aspect today, which was really this um, social organizing uh, publications look at this type of group, right? The Women's Medical Auxiliary for the most part. But there's an entire other wing of this project that I have been working on that looks at, and this will get clearer when I kind of am able to access more individual stories than I have access to now. I look at really what practice looks like and what labor looks like in kind of modernizing American medicine. So I'm really interested in the doctor's wife as a medical worker in some senses, right? How do they interface with nurses? What type of nursing work had they been enlisted to do, especially in an earlier time period as nursing itself is professionalizing? What about all that kind of like bookkeeping work or, maybe medical assistant kind of work? The, volunteering, interacting with patients, either kind of, when they call home to the doctor, or, if the office is adjacent to the home or the wife is nearby, how does she interact with patients, which is, not something that happens today, but certainly happened in a previous era. So I'm really trying to get a sense of the kind of gendering of medical labor through the figure of the doctor's wife, because that's, I think, a figure that complicates a lot of our histories of medicine and professionalization. Um, and I think it'll be really exciting to see what I can find, because in so many histories of medicine, we know what's going on, but if you stop and think about it, like that one person who commented said, there's someone there in the shadows, right? I want to put the spotlight on that person in the shadows and see what that does to our understanding of medical practice in a whole bunch of different ways. So I'm excited about getting there, but that's perhaps the more ambitious part of the project that I'll have to maybe come back and give another talk about in a couple years.
Well, that's great, and we look forward to seeing and being a part of your research, here at the National Library of Medicine, and certainly all who've tuned in today who represent libraries and archives whose collections can be of use to you. A few of them
Yes,
have
please.
written pointedly, so it's a great opportunity for us all to connect in this regard around your great research, and look forward to keeping in touch. And on behalf of my colleagues here at the NLM, we really thank you for putting this talk together, being a part of our interview series on our blog circulating now, and we look forward to keeping in touch. And I will follow up with you with the contacts that I have and a few ideas to be helpful. And always, to you and everyone who's watching, if we could be a resource for you in your work further, or for the first time for some of you, don't hesitate to reach out. So Dr. Donnell, thank you very much for your great talk this afternoon, and again for preparing it and our mutual support and engagement. Thank you.
Thank you.
You are welcome. So before we depart this afternoon, I just want to remind those of you who are watching that you can tune in to the next NLM History Talk, which will be the final one of our calendar year on Thursday, November 2nd at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Please join us to welcome Melissa B. Reynolds. Dr. Reynolds is a Mellon Postdoctoral Fellow in the Wolf Humanities Center, as well as lecturer in history and sociology of science at the University of Pennsylvania. She will be speaking on reading remedy books, manuscripts, and the making of a national medical tradition. And please also look for an interview with Dr. Reynolds on our blog circulating now. So with that, thanks again to Dr. O'Donnell, and thank you all for tuning in this afternoon. We'll see you on November 2nd and look forward to keeping in touch during that time and thereafter. Thank you. Bye-bye.